for claims of moral superiority. Okay? Remember? If you've got life, then you've got that special isness, that special stuff that gives us an obligation, right, to treat you morally, right, to respect you, to extend practical respect to you, right, if you have this stuff called life, right? But, okay, and the minute you start creating a hierarchy, remember the hierarchy I gave you guys, the 7 different kinds of animals, right? 7 different kinds of living beings, right? Remember that slide from last week or the week before? Noss and Sessions argue that the minute you start to create a hierarchy of value, to start talk about humans have moral rights full-fledged and they're the only ones, and that dolphins are a little below there because they might not be able to make promises, but they're so fully aware of themselves, and then down the list you go, right? And that, by the way, is an old idea. The great chain of being is part of the Judeo-Christian and the Platonic Aristotelian traditions that are thousands of years old, right? So, and in a way, when you start making these hierarchies among different beings in nature, you're just duplicating that great chain of being, aren't you? And you're just duplicating the same colonial structure, aren't you? Maybe not the same exact one, but the structure itself, the hierarchy, the very notion of hierarchy of value is part of a system of domination. Right? And we want to get away from the domination. And so let's not talk about hierarchies of value, and let's just be biocentric egalitarians. Okay? No hierarchies at all. Sessions cautions that any comparative axiology, right? Humans, dolphins, dogs, right, all the way down to worms, right? Any comparative axiology merely reinstates a pecking order in the moral barnyard. The second principle of deep ecology is metaphysical holism, philosophically, right? We're trying to reconstruct their philosophy. One can apprehend ontological interconnectedness through enlightenment or self-realization. The mature human being, okay, is one who has achieved enlightenment. Kant, in a definition which still probably is good enough today, what is enlightenment? Kant says enlightenment is the attainment of liberty from self-imposed immaturity, right? Enlightenment is freedom from self-imposed immaturity. And the deep ecologists argue that to grow up, right, to get away from your self-imposed immaturity, you have to accept you have to accept that you have that you're not morally more important than anybody else, okay? This is part of enlightenment, right? Recognition of the ontological interconnectedness, right, that pervades everything in nature is part of growing up, right? Becoming enlightened. All the ecologists all say that too, right? Schweitzer says that. Schweitzer says he's giving us moral norms. He's giving us character norms too. He's not just giving us action norms. We are better people once we recognize our interconnectedness, right? Once we recognize all the implications of our embodiment and interrelatedness, then we are better people as our characters are better, right? Okay. We can make no firm ontological divide in reality between the human and the non-human realms. To the extent that we perceive boundaries, we fall short of deep ecological consciousness. Through this awakening, the ontological boundaries of the self extend outward, right? That's what growing up means. Your sense of self extends increasingly outward beyond your body, right? Incorporating more and more of the biotic world, the life world, land, air, water, wildlife, right? Into yourself. Okay? This insight discloses kind of woo-woo Eastern mysticism kind of insight, right? This insight discloses that there is in reality only one big self, the life world. Okay, and they cite this guy Alan Watts, who was really popular in the late 60s counterculture movement. Kind of cool, actually. I like Alan Watts' books. But anyway, if you're interested in that notion of expanded selfhood, then read The World is Your Body by Alan Watts. Okay, once ontological boundaries between living beings are recognized as illusory, one realizes that biospherical interests are one's own. Duvall and Sessions assert that if we harm the rest of nature, then we are harming ourselves. There are no boundaries, and everything is interrelated. In the words of the environmental activist John Seed, the statement, "I am protecting the rainforest," develops into, "I am part of the rainforest, protecting myself." I am that part of the rainforest recently emerged into thinking. The change is a spiritual one, thinking like a mountain, sometimes referred to as deep ecology. Okay? Thinking like a mountain, of course, you know. Maybe Uncle Aldo should best be understood as a forerunner of deep ecology. Because the rainforest is part of the activist John Seed, he is inherently obliged to look after its welfare. The rainforest's well-being and needs are indistinguishable from Seed's. Okay? See how they do that? That's kind of tricky, isn't it? Is that fair? It seems pretty fair. I don't know. Ecofeminists have a problem with this, though, so we'll see. And other social ecologists have take issue with this notion of expanded selfhood. So, Noss and Sessions have emphatically emphasized the phenomenological spirit of deep ecology and downplayed rules, downplayed dicta, downplayed moral theory, downplayed norms. They don't want to describe deep ecology as an environmental ethic. They don't. They want to describe deep ecology as an environmental consciousness, an environmental life way, mode of experience. Okay? The psychological realization of metaphysical holism makes ethics superfluous. Okay? Because ethics, as distinguished and demarcated by these ivory tower philosophers in this abstract fashion, doesn't really exist. Ethics is not really different than experience. Ethics and epistemology are always interwoven, right? So the idea of separating ethics from the rest of experience is something that Noss is just going to reject. And so he's going to say, I'm not giving you an environmental ethic, I'm giving you a worldview. And that worldview has certain ethical implications, but it's not an ethic, it's a worldview. The search is not for environmental ethics, but for ecological consciousness. Okay, that's a really important point. And it's one way of kind of deflecting a lot of criticisms of deep ecology. Because they're saying, no, look, I'm not offering this as a theory, as a normative theory. I'm offering this as an account of experience. And you can do with it what you will. All right. So let's move on to some criticisms. And goodness, I don't know what we're going to do on Thursday. I'm sure we'll figure something out. There's a lot of stuff. You know, there's just a lot of literature out there. I actually ran into somebody on the river who lived on a boat, and he couldn't keep his book because he said it was getting kind of moldy. So he gave it to me. But it's the Derek Jensen Reader. Derek Jensen is another pretty popular figure. A lot of very radical green thinkers come out of a deep ecology perspective. So there's really a lot, there's so much we can cover. So criticisms of deep ecology. The deep ecological principles of biocentric egalitarianism and metaphysical holism have elicited robust critiques. Some of the most interesting debates have centered on the normative status of deep ecology. Okay? And this goes back to the previous slide where Noss insists that he's not offering us a normative theory, he's offering us a new account of experience and a new and a path to ecological consciousness and not to some kind of moral theory. He says that Noss insists that deep ecology is essentially descriptive. It's not prescriptive, it's descriptive. For Noss, unmitigated empiricism or eco-phenomenology promotes a direct experience of the qualities of nature, its concrete contents. Very bold claim, isn't it? Deep ecology, he argues, is simply an enumeration of general principles that command the assent of persons open to the direct apprehension of nature. So you're not grown up if you can't apprehend nature this way, and you're just not paying attention. That's what he's saying. He's saying you're just not paying attention. If you cannot understand that we have obligations, or if you cannot understand our interconnection with the natural world, then you're not paying attention. All right? Scholars have found that the disclaimer that deep ecology is not a normative system and ought not be judged as such disingenuous. So some people react to Knaus's claim that he's not offering a normative system by saying, come on, of course you are. That's what you're motivated by. You want to change the world, and you believe that there is a right and wrong way to treat ecological wholes, right? And so you are offering us a normative system, and you ought to be held to the standards of these other normative systems, right? Okay, and then we're about to encounter Brian Norton and his insightful criticisms. Okay, so some scholars have treated deep ecology as the legitimate object of the analysis of moral philosophy. Some regard deep ecology as strident, axiological egalitarianism. Think Schweitzer here too. This is the kind of charge that people will level at Schweitzer too. That is useless in adjudicating conflicting interests. Everything, right, has the same moral status, including the mosquitoes that carry malaria, right? And this was one of the criticisms of Schweitzer's view of reverence for life, that if your view is carried out consistently, then we are prohibited from killing those mosquitoes, especially systematically, right? You can't just spray everything with DDT. Schweitzer, remember though, ended up agreeing that in some cases we do need to kill other organisms like the mosquitoes that spread malaria. But the point that these critics of deep ecology and these critics of Schweitzer are making is that, look, you can't have it both ways. You're saying that you're trying to say that everything has moral status, but then you're also saying that at a practical level, some things have to be discarded or their moral status has to be ignored. And yet you have and yet your principle of biocentric egalitarianism doesn't leave any of that kind of wiggle room, So you're doing something else now, and that's a little bit dishonest. That's a little bit disingenuous, right? The principle of biocentric egalitarianism, on this view, renders deep ecology impotent as an ethical theory. Environmental ethics is predicated on the possibility of a non-egalitarian axiology. Okay? In the words of the American philosopher Brian Norton, the 120,000th elk cannot be treated equally with one of the last California condors, not at least on a reasonable environmental ethic. Okay? It's just, biocentric egalitarianism tells us that the individual elk in a giant herd, has morally the same value as one of the last California condors. And any reasonable environmental ethic, has to kind of, there's a problem there, isn't there? Don't we want to have some good reason to treat the condor differently than we treat the numerous elk? Baird Collicutt has surmised that environmental ethics must manifestly not accord equal moral worth to each and every member of the biotic community. These scholars argue, therefore, that biocentric egalitarianism must be scrapped. Okay, and this is probably the fatal defect in deep ecology, the structural tensions between biocentric egalitarianism and metaphysical holism, all right? There are irresolvable structural tensions between biocentric egalitarianism and metaphysical holism and ecological values. In light of the real functions of living natural systems, it is impossible to even come close to affirming both the ability of all individuals to flourish to old age and the integrity and stability of ecosystems. The necessity of, right? So there's a tension there. And the deep ecologists are being a little bit philosophically lazy because they're trying to affirm these two not always compatible positions, right? Every living thing has intrinsic value is one of their positions, right? Part of their mishmash, part of their metaphysical bricolage. And the other part of their metaphysical bricolage is holism, right? Ecological wholes have moral status. And yet we know that the moral status of ecological wholes is in conflict with the moral status of some individual organisms, right? So we cannot affirm them both, right? We have to choose. We can't just be both. The necessity of, for example, okay? The necessity of exterminating ungulates, like deer and elk, or goats and pigs, for the sake of the health of fragile tropical island ecosystems is but one example. Regard for the health of whole ecosystems might therefore require treating individuals differently, because individuals of different species have unequal utility or disutility for wholes. Okay? If that were the case, then viewed from the standpoint of an entire ecosystem, biocentric egalitarianism and metaphysical holism might be mutually exclusive and inconsistent with each other to the extent that at least one would have to be abandoned, or perhaps both. All right, and then social ecologists and ecofeminists have also formulated robust critiques of deep ecology. Social ecologists, speaking as secular humanists of the European Enlightenment tradition, have excoriated biocentric egalitarianism as misanthropic. In particular, Murray Bookchin criticized deep ecology for reducing humans from complex social beings to a simple species, a scourge that is overpopulating the planet, devouring its resources. Bookchin argues that deep ecologists' ahistorical zoologization of human beings prevents them from seeing the real cultural causes of environmental problems. I've let this slide through a couple times too, and I regret it in comments that I've made and other people. Just recognizing the human being as a big part of an invasive exotic animal that's causing all this environmental destruction. Murray Bookchin is the voice that always jumps in my head when I catch myself doing that. And he's the voice that reminds you of the fact that this technological termite, that the human animal seems to have been, I don't know, we've all been turned into these technological termites by our culture, by history, by our economic system. And it wasn't always like that. And so we need to be careful and not identify humans as a scourge and the principal cause of planetary ecocide. We need to be careful and remember that it's human beings under the influence of a particular culture and of a particular economic system that's quite new. That's historically an anomaly, right? Capitalism, a historical anomaly. The competitiveness and greed and narcissism that are encouraged in 21st century Western cultures are historical anomalies, to say the least, right? I mean, these are values and ways of being in the world that were strongly discouraged and condemned throughout the vast majority of the course of human history, of human existence, right? 100,000 years old is I think, reasonable estimate of the age of human culture, right? We've been around, human cultures have been around for 100,000 years. And out of those 100,000 years, only the last 1,000 or 2,000 of those 100,000 years could be characterized as anything like what we experience now, where we're in competition with Earth. And right? Our history has been characterized by cooperativeness and getting along with one another, much more than by competition. And so this animal that's causing all this destruction isn't really the human animal. It's the human animal under the influence of a certain cultural paradigm. And Bookchin is always careful to point this out, and this is one of his pet peeves with deep ecologists, because deep ecologists too often fall into the language of misanthropy, right? The language of anti-human, like our friend Edward Abbey, right? Who says he'd rather shoot a man than a rattlesnake. And anyway, so yes, go ahead.
But wouldn't Birch disagree, because he said that Western tradition thought, like since the beginning, since first writing, since Gilgamesh?
Even Gilgamesh, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they essentially declared a war on the leaders of Lebanon.
Yes, but even Gilgamesh is what, 5,000 BCE or 3,000 BCE, somewhere around there.
The oldest thing that we can have
the oldest document. So, but even that, Bookchin would say, is only of recent human cultural history.
You don't think they had oral traditions that have the exact same?
Well, I don't know. I don't know. It's all speculative. But I think Bookchin's point is just a cautionary point about not reading a cultural manifestation of anthropos as the essential anthropos. Okay? That's all. He just cautions us. Whether or not, there are these deeper tendencies. And Bookchin, I should note, I know we're not talking about Bookchin yet, but Bookchin and many social ecologists refuse to be identified as Marxist because they don't accept the Marxist thesis that the economy, that economic factors are the most important factors driving the domination of humans by other humans. He thinks there are ideological structures that are much deeper than, and so, capitalism itself, if we were to overthrow capitalism, Bookchin would say we still have a lot more work to do, that there are still hierarchical relationships that pervade our society and that also inform our relationship with the non-human world that we still need to work on. And just getting rid of capitalism isn't going to solve very much. We need to go deeper than that. So anyway, this interesting questions though. Both deep ecologists and social ecologists are drawn towards studies of ancient human, of pre-patriarchal societies. There are these very tantalizing studies of early human cultures, but when I read them, I always take them with a grain of salt because we're reconstructing something that's so remote, and how do we know, right? It's very, very difficult to understand, what these people were thinking and how they related to each other. But there are some tantalizing hints, that other cultures were not patriarchal and were matriarchal and were more anarchic in the sense of being non-hierarchical. Anarchism, or anarchy as I understand it, has a technical definition, and that technical definition is just an absence of hierarchy, right? And no structure, anarchy. Not a structure, but not a hierarchical structure where there's superiority and inferiority, right? All right, so, and then ecofeminists have also made their own criticisms, a little sharper probably than social ecologists. Ecofeminism is a branch of social ecology, as I will teach it, and I think it's fair, a very reasonable way to approach ecofeminism is an offshoot of social ecology. So in the estimation of ecological feminists, the idea of self-realization, right? This idea that as we mature, as we realize ourselves, our sense of self gets expanded to include the whole earth. That idea itself, that account of what maturity consists of, is itself patriarchal. And for that matter, the whole quest for a normative theory is patriarchal. So, and a lot of ecofeminists insist that we're so trapped in a bad history that we need to, that we can't even put together we don't know what a better normative theory is going to look like because we're so trapped in patriarchy. So we need to overcome that. And then we can start thinking about, well, what is the nature of our obligation to the more than human world? The Australian philosopher Val Plumwood, for instance, argued that the notion of the expanded self results in boundary problems stemming from the impulse of subordination. Val Plumwood actually used to be called Val Sylvan. She was married to they were the Rutleys, that's right. It was Val and Richard Rutley. And they were kind of like this power couple in Australia, environmental philosophy power couple, right? And then they got divorced. And then Richard changed his name to Richard Sylvan, and Val changed her name to Val Plumwood. So the Rutleys just kind of disappeared. But Richard Rutley was the guy he was the last man. Remember that last human exam, that famous thought experiment? He's the guy that wrote that essay. Richard Rutley. Anyway, but they both were very, very influential. There are serious conflicts of interest between constituent members of larger wholes. And Plumwood has argued expansionary selfhood does not adequately recognize the reality of these conflicts. In the political arena, the expansionary wholist is forced into the arrogant position of implying that everyone in disagreement does not in fact understand what is in his or her own best interest. Ecofeminists suspect that self-realization is a front for an imperialistic philosophy of self. As is maybe wilderness preservation. That's what our friend Tom Birch is saying, right? Wilderness preservation and intrinsic value in ecological wholes is a front for an imperialistic philosophy, right? That's what Birch says. And that's what ecofeminists are saying about deep ecologists. Right? So the impulse toward wilderness preservation and the impulse toward conceiving oneself as, in this expansive way, both reflect, they both come from the same motive, to control, all right? By setting aside wilderness areas, we're controlling the wild, right? We're putting the mark of the empire on the wild and containing it then, right? And we're also saying that this wilderness is special, but everything else is not, right? We divide the world into either either a set of utilities, right, which is 99% of the planet, right? And then these little tiny pockets, right? Like Indian reservations too, right? But these are wilderness reservations, these little tiny pockets of places that are locked up, right? Untrammeled by man, right? But by designating them as such, we open the door, we green light, right? We give a green light to the exploitation of everything else. Everything else becomes a sacrifice zone, becomes a mere utility, right? So there's a sense in which, sadly enough, these, what were they doing? What were these radical environmentalists doing when they set aside these various wilderness reserves? Maybe what they were doing wasn't quite what they thought they were doing. But in the end, Birch says that it's good, right? But what Birch says is that we need to remember why we reserve wilderness areas. And it's not just to preserve something super special, it's to preserve our wildness, to preserve our embodiment and interrelatedness, right? That's why we're doing it. And that's what we have to reconstruct as environmentalists, right? The possibility of deontic experience, of all this whole range of values. Okay. So anyway, these various critiques have contributed to the point. Wow. A lot of work has been done. I mentioned that the last time I lectured on deep ecology was very rudimentary and when I didn't know very much. And that was maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And in the last 5 or 6 years, some progress has been made among the environmental ethics community, the academic philosophers who study this stuff, and we have reached a consensus that this is quite likely that deep ecology has reached its logical conclusion and has exhausted itself. Okay, for example, in the respected textbook Environmental Philosophy, the section on deep ecology, which enjoyed a coveted place in the first 3 editions, was eliminated in the 4th edition. Compared to other prominent theories, deep ecology has not crystallized into a complete system. As Rothenberg states in the English revision of Nass's earlier deep ecological thinking, is process without end. I think I left out a word there. Okay? Deep ecological thinking is process without end. All right? For Rothenberg, deep ecology is a set of prescient hints about the real relations of culture and nature. Okay, and so this is the last. There's Professor Nass again. He's a human in the wild. Right? We're all wild, right? Let's just be wild. What's that?
I said he's out there right now. He's just wandering around.
He is, yeah. All right, this is their platform, okay? And keep in mind, I almost thought of trying to go to the store or trying to find an apron and come into class with an apron on, because this is described, deep ecology is often depicted in the form of an apron diagram. Let's see, anyway. But the platform is in the middle, and then in the middle of the apron, right? And then the ultimate principles can be any kind of ultimate. There may be many, right? Nass acknowledges 3 main ones. Buddhism as providing a metaphysical substructure or superstructure for deep ecology. But he says take your pick. And he's a pluralist. He says take your pick. These ultimate principles, there are lots of different ones you can use. Philosophy, going back, this is Spinoza, secular metaphysics, in which he uses philosophy to describe, and then also Christian. He thinks that in the tradition of Christian mysticism, among the Christian mystics, like St. Francis, for example, you can find the metaphysical underpinnings or superstructure for deep ecology. And then the platform are these 8 points here, okay? This is the deep ecology platform. And then the lower part of the apron, right, comes down. Think of this, right? This is the part of the apron that goes across here, and then, anyway, and then down the skirt of the apron is where you get all your practical, right? You get an understanding of general consequences here. General consequences of, what happens when we do this. And then finally you get specific rules, like protect biodiversity. Even more specific, like don't use chemical sprays to control insects, recycle, right? All kinds of. So, but the position of where he puts these deep ecological, this platform is a very strong indication that Arne Naess and his colleagues, who put deep ecology together philosophically originally, they view it as a very pluralistic philosophy, okay? Pluralistic in the sense that you can come from all kinds of different metaphysical, even religious traditions, right? And find a home for the platform. All these things can be justified with reference to all kinds of different, right, rich traditions, some of which are very old, some of which are newer, right, some of which are philosophical, some of which might be religious, okay? And that's his way, of saying that deep ecology has a big tent, right? It's open to all kinds of different points of view, and perhaps it's another way of reaffirming the point that Brian Norton made when he talks about the convergence hypothesis, right? It doesn't really matter what your metaphysical orientation is. I mean, it matters to you, and some of us like, our heavy metaphysics a little more than others. But ultimately, we can all converge around these platforms, right? Around these 8 basic points. We can converge around them, okay? And the metaphysical stuff, he leaves open to different traditions, which means he's a pluralist, right? He's not going to try to pin us down. And again, if he looks at this natural resource values wheel, he's not going to try to pin us down, and he's going to say, look, the more of these experiences you can encourage, the more healthy your culture is going to be, right? He gives us some pretty powerful resources for cultural criticism, right? And for arriving at some conclusions about how we ought to be constructing our culture, right? In light of what we know about ecology. Okay, so I'm sure I'll figure out, we'll mine the riches of deep ecology on Thursday some more. And maybe if it's weather like this, maybe we'll even go home early on Thursday. All right? So I'll see you all on Thursday.